Okay, we're starting Hebrews again. We're in the fourth chapter now, and we've been digging in for quite a while now, and I hope we've been turning up lots of things that you've been able to benefit from and understand Hebrews better. We've mentioned many times before that Hebrews is a difficult book to understand, partly because of the audience that it was written to and the words that are used to describe things for them. So we've been trying to bring out those things that are odd and unusual and help you to understand them. And we skipped last week because I was away on vacation and Cynthia filled in for me. But the 2 weeks before that, we were talking about chapter 4, where it is discussing that eternal rest, that eternal Sabbath, and that leads ultimately to our Sabbath keeping. And so what we did with that lesson is we kind of did an overview of it, sort of a paraphrase or an outline of what the chapter is talking about there, because it's a difficult thing that he goes to explain. And today we're going to dig into the verses and actually see how he says those things. So we're going to be looking at all of that in detail. But last week we covered Moses. That was where we started. And Moses was an important person to the Jews of Jesus' time. We know that because they talked about Moses many times. And they had an undue high respect for Moses. They kind of had forgotten sometimes that Moses was still just a man. But Moses was something special. There's no doubt about it. He had the closest relationship to God of any prophet up to Jesus' time. And so there was just nothing like him until that time, no other prophet like him. And Moses himself spoke about another prophet that was going to come, another prophet like him, he says. And so another prophet who is going to have the same closeness with God that he has. And we know that he was speaking about Jesus. They didn't understand that at that time, though. But that's one of the many clues to what the Messiah was going to be. And those verses that we studied in Hebrews talked about his place where Moses really does belong. And they said that God called him the head of the house that he had built. And so Moses was the head of the house, and we looked at what that means. It meant that he was the head servant of all the servants. So he was the one who was in charge of them. And so what that really means is that Moses was a man like all other men. He wasn't somehow different from other men. He was just the person that God had chosen to be in charge of all the other men. So he was a servant of the house, put in charge of the other servants, is what the verses says. And so we understand Moses correctly and his position correctly through that. And we know that that house was built by God. And so Jesus is much greater than Moses because he is the builder of the house that Moses was a servant of and also in charge of other servants. So we dug into Moses a little bit there. And then we moved on to, as I talked about earlier, that overview or that outline of the rest of most of the chapter. And what that is talking about is it starts by talking about faith, and then it talks about entering into God's rest by faith, and then it talks about Sabbath keeping at the end. And I'm going to give you a really brief outline here of what that is, and then we'll dig into the verses. As I said, these are difficult verses, so I'm trying to ease you in as much as I can here. So those verses are going to be saying the Israelites in the wilderness showed that they had no faith. Despite what God would do for them or to them, they simply couldn't trust him. And they would never do that. And God got tired of that. And he said, these people don't know me at all. They don't know my ways. They don't trust me. They will never enter into my rest. And we'll see those verses that talk about that. And the verses also will talk about the same is true of us. We have to be careful that we don't make that same mistake of failing to trust God and ultimately turning away from him and sinning. And we'll see the verses that cover that. And so it continues on by saying the promise of entering into God's rest has existed from creation. So the seventh day rest that God took was that same rest that we will enter into. Now that seems like a difficult concept. I'm not going to go into it here. But nonetheless, that is that same rest. And we'll see the verses that talk about that. And so the author goes to a bit of effort to make sure that people understand that the rest that the Israelites received when they entered into the promised land was not that rest that God had promised them, that future rest. And so he goes on from that to say, because that the promised land wasn't the fulfillment of that promised rest, then that promised rest still exists, and the promise of it still exists. And ultimately, because the promise of it still exists, we still keep the Sabbath. And so that's the whole argument here in really nuts and bolts fashion that I hope you're going to be able to understand as we go through the verses. So this section begins with a verse from the last study, which was chapter 3, verse 6. And that's the one where it was still talking about Moses and his house and him being the master of the house or the head servant of the house. And it says, if we are his house, if we will hold the confidence and the pride of his gospel until the end. Now, it's a bit off topic, but we've talked about that idea of until the end being a necessity. It isn't good enough that you once believed in God and then turned away. You need to keep that confidence, that faith until the end. But what's going to happen here in the text is the author of Hebrews is going to start with this word confidence, and then he's going to roll confidence into faith in a few steps. And I'll show you when those happen. And so he's trying to take the idea from confidence, which is, we understand confidence is that we are confident, we are assured of something that is going to happen. And he's going to turn that into faith and help the audience that he's speaking to understand that. And all through this, we have to ask the question, why is the author of Hebrews explaining these things to this particular audience? Why do the Hebrews need to hear these words? And it seems the answer to that is that they are having trouble with faith, and they're showing faithlessness. And we've seen a few quotes already about the things that they were starting to lose faith in, and there was a complaint that by the author that he had to teach them again these things that were the very basic foundations of Christianity, because they had fallen in faith and lost faith and didn't trust things. And so it seems like his talk here about faith is largely based on the idea that the Hebrews are not showing much faith. So now we'll dig into the verses. And we'll begin with this chunk of verses here, and I'll explain what this chunk is. It's a quote from another place in the Bible. So Hebrews 3, verse 7 through 11. Because the Spirit of holiness said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts to anger him, like the rebellious, and as the day of temptation in the wilderness. So he's referring back to the Israelites now. When your fathers tempted me, and they proved and saw my works 40 years. Because of this, I was weary with that generation, and I said, that is a people which deceives their heart, and they have not known my ways. And I swore in my anger, they shall not enter my rest. Okay, so that's a quote from Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11. And that word today that I've highlighted there is a word we're going to see a bunch of here. What the author of Psalms 95, which is David, or ultimately God speaking through David, is using today as with a different meaning. It just doesn't mean today, it means all future days. It means every day is today. You can't be in a day that isn't today, and therefore every day is today. And so this offer that God is talking about of if you'll hear my voice, don't turn away from me today. He means any day that you are alive is still a day when you can take advantage of this offer. And so the word today is being used in that sense of all future days. And so keep that in mind, because we're going to see that again. We talked about this a little bit in the last lesson, and contrasted that with a Spanish word, the Spanish word for tomorrow, which is mañana. It's often used in a different way. It's used to indicate a day that never comes. And so mañana is a day that never comes. Today is a day that's always here. I hope that makes some sense. So what had happened that God is complaining about it, and he talks about in the wilderness, and he talks about a particular place in the wilderness, Meribah, and in that case, God gave them water from a rock. Like there was a rock, and Moses hit that rock, and water gushed out of the rock, and the people still wouldn't trust in God. They just couldn't ever come to that point where they would do that, and they kept wanting him to do things to prove that. They wanted to kind of control him and to get him to do things so that they would feel secure, because they had no faith. And they just couldn't trust him because of their own problems, I guess. And God in this verse says, your fathers tempted me. And what he means by tempted is they wanted to control me. They wanted to tell me what to do. And God wanted them to trust him. And they weren't capable of that. And God got tired of that. You can easily imagine that. After many, many years, he said these words, that their lack of faith would keep them from entering into my rest. And the psalmist says, they shall not enter my rest. And so these verses from Psalms are going to be the basis for all of the discussion that comes after this. What's going to happen is the author is going to take this and break it down into pieces, just as we do in our own Bible studies, and break out sentences or parts of sentences. And he's going to say, look at this, see what this says. What does this mean? If you understand this, you can see this. And so the same way that we break down the Bible, the author here, New Testament author, is using an Old Testament set of verses, 5 verses from Psalms, as the basis for what he's going to be teaching here. And so we're going to be seeing parts of this again as he goes through it. I told you that Hebrews could be complicated in what he does. Okay, so beginning in Hebrews again, he says, beware therefore, my brethren, lest there be an evil, unfaithful heart in any of you, and you depart from the living God. But inquire of yourselves every day until the day that is called today. And so that's that today reference again. So when he says until the day that is called today, well, every day is called today because there's no other name for it. You're always in today. And so he says, as long as there is a day called today, this offer stands for you. And he says, every day you should also inquire of yourselves. You should check yourselves to make sure that you aren't falling away. And what he says there is, lest any one of you should be hardened by the deception of sin. For we have been joined with the Messiah, if we shall hold fast to this true covenant from the beginning to the end. And so he's saying there, don't be like these guys in the wilderness who constantly had unfaithfulness and couldn't ever trust in God. He says, what you need to do is you need to monitor yourself daily, every day that is called today, which is every day. And he says, do that monitoring of yourself to make sure that you are remaining faithful, because sin and the deception of sin will harden your heart and drag you away if you aren't careful. So we need to keep watching over ourselves, watch what Satan is trying to do to get us to trick and fall into. We'll need to be watching for the deceptiveness of sin that is all around us. And in the society that we live in, we get lots of bad messages that can lead us on wrong paths as well. So the same truths that were true for him are true for us as well. Every one of the people he's talking to need to be checking themselves daily. We need to be doing the same thing. And he's going to repeat this idea of the need to hold fast until the end. And we talked about that a little bit there. And then Hebrews 3:15 continues on with that today reference. It says, just as it was said, so now here he's quoting from Psalms again, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts to anger him. And so today is being used again in that meaning of every day, which is today. Okay, Hebrews 3:16 through 19. For who were those who heard and angered him? Was it not all of these who went out from Egypt by Moses? And with whom was he wearied 40 years? But with them who sinned and whose bones fell in the wilderness. And concerning whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but those who were unconvinced? And we see that they could not enter because they did not believe. So what he's doing here is he's asking his audience questions or to think about things. He says, who was it that angered God? Well, it was everyone who left Egypt with Moses. All of those people could never, ever trust in God. And who was God wearied by? Well, he was wearied by those people who sinned because they were unconvinced. Remember that not absolutely everyone who had come out of Moses was turned away by God. There were a couple exceptions. So those who sinned, because they were unconvinced, and now unconvinced is a word along with confidence, and this was because they did not believe. They sinned because they were unconvinced and they did not believe in God, and that wearied God is what he's saying. So I talked about this idea that he's going to start with the word confidence, and take that in steps. So what's happened here is he's used the word confidence again and paired that up with convinced, and he's taken it one step into believe. So confidence has become believing now. And we'll see another step coming up next. And so he says that generation's lack of faith became their bones in the desert. That was just the outcome of their lack of faith. God said they would never enter into my rest, and they did not. And that was because of their lack of faith. Hebrews 4 now. We've now moved into chapter 4 of Hebrews. So it says, let us fear, therefore, lest while the promise of entering into this rest stands, any of you should be found to come short of entering. For we also were evangelized as they were, but the word did not benefit those who heard, because it was not joined with faith by those who heard it. That's all pretty straightforward stuff, I think. But again, he's going back to this idea of you need to inspect yourselves for as long as the promise of a future rest exists. And so we need to keep monitoring ourselves. And he says that here. Let us fear, therefore, that we don't become found to come short of entering. And so we need to monitor ourselves. They heard the word, he says, just as we heard the word. But it didn't benefit them, didn't do them any good, because they just couldn't pair that up with faith. And they never could come to trust in God. And because of that, they lost their opportunity to enter into that. And so what we see now is he's done this transition that I talked about that he was going to do. He started with confidence, which was paired with convinced, same idea. And he takes that into belief, and then he takes it into faith now. So now he's using the word faith of that. And so that progression shows what should be really the progression of faith within all of us, is that we become convinced, we believe, and we have faith. And so next he's going to dig into this question of, but what was the rest that they could not enter? And what was, what exactly is that? Because the verse here only says entering into his rest. It doesn't say what that rest is. So now he's going to dig into what exactly that rest is and what's meant by those words. And Hebrews 4, 3-4 says, but we who believe enter into rest. But just as he said, as I swore in my anger, they shall not enter my rest. For behold, the works of God have existed from the foundation of the world, according to what he said about the Sabbath. God rested on the seventh day from all his works. So what he's doing there is he's quoting Genesis to say God rested on the seventh day from all his works. That was my rest, or God's rest, not my personal rest. But that's what is referred to by my rest in this verse. And so he says that rest that God took is the rest that we can enter into if we have faith. And so he's really taken kind of 2 or 3 verses here to take the hard way to say my rest when in Psalms refers to the rest that God took after creation. So that's really all there is to this. He says the works of God have existed from the foundation of the world, and what he means by that is the Sabbath began with that seventh day, and it has existed from that time. And it continues on. That rest continues on, and that rest is the same rest that we can enter into. And it's really no more complicated than that. It's just an awful lot more words, perhaps more words than necessary to explain the idea. Okay, now Hebrews 4, 5-6. It says, and here again he said, they shall not enter my rest. So just like I was telling you before, he's going to keep pulling from that Psalms 95 set of verses and keep pulling pieces out of that and breaking them down and saying, look at what this means. So here he says, and here again he said, they shall not enter my rest. Because therefore there has been an opportunity for each person to enter, and those who were first evangelized did not enter, in that they were not persuaded. So his point here is that they shall not enter my rest, and the reason was, he says, that they were not persuaded. And so the word persuaded is linked to that same word convinced. If someone talks to you about something and tries to convince you of something, they tell you about the good things and all of the things that you need to understand about it, and they try to persuade you. And in this case, you should be persuaded. All of the miracles that God did, all of those things, you would think that those would be persuasive enough that the Israelites in the desert would have been convinced of God. But that isn't what happened. They simply couldn't ever be convinced. They couldn't ever be confident in God. They couldn't have any belief in him. They couldn't have any faith in him. And so that's what the point of this is that they heard the same message of God, and they were never persuaded by that message. And so when he says they, he doesn't only refer to the Israelites. He's saying that they in that message can refer to us as well. And so hearing the word is not enough. You need to take that hearing of the word and be convinced by that. And once you're convinced of that, once the word persuades you to be convinced, let's say it that way, then you can take those steps to real solid faith. And he says, though only those who believe will enter into the God's rest. And all of this is pretty straightforward stuff, I think, for us. But it's interesting how he goes about saying it and how he thinks about it. Okay, Hebrews 4, 7 through 8, which says, again he appointed another day after much time, just as it is written above that David said, today, if you listen to his voice, do not harden your hearts. So again, this is quoting from Psalm 95 again. This time he takes a little bit bigger piece of it. And Psalm 95 was written by David, and so that's the connection there. And it says, for if Yeshua, son of Nun, had given them rest, he would not afterward have spoken of another day. Now this is a bit of a complicated thing, so I'll explain it. In Hebrew Aramaic, the name Joshua is the same as the name Jesus, okay? We say them differently, but Yeshua is really the same name. Joshua or Yehoshua sometimes in Hebrew is the way it's written, but it's also written in the exact same way as Yeshua. And so what he's doing here by saying son of Nun is he's making it clear who he's talking about. So when he says, if Yeshua, son of Nun, what he really means is the Joshua of the Old Testament who took over after Moses, after the Israelites, or he took the Israelites into the promised land and helped them fight their battles. And so he's making that distinction that this isn't the Yeshua of Jesus, it is the Joshua. So that's what he's making clear there. In English, we have different words for both of those, so we don't confuse Jesus and Joshua, but that's what he's doing. And so what he's saying there is that Joshua was the son of Nun, Jesus was not, so I'm talking about Joshua. And so if Joshua had given them rest by taking them into the promised land, then David would not afterward have spoken of another day. And so David in Psalms is talking about a today that still exists. And he says, the psalmist David is saying in his time, which is much after Joshua's time, that rest is still available to us. Do not harden your hearts. Today you can still enter into that. And so that's the message here is that the rest was not fulfilled. The promised rest was not fulfilled by Joshua taking the people into the promised land. Hope that makes some sense. As I said, Hebrews has difficult concepts in it. Okay, so the point here is that the rest that we're speaking of was not received with the promised land. And we know that because David, much later, after they entered into the promised land, spoke of a future rest that still existed. And that's the rest that has always existed from the beginning of time, which was the rest that God took after creation. Are there any questions? I know this is some difficult stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot of information there, but I think that Hebrews is a very complex book, but it's also one of the most important books in the New Testament, if not the most.
Yes.
And I think it's critical that we understand it because it isn't a very important book to us. We're not really sure who wrote it. Some people say Paul, others say Apollos. And we just don't really know for sure, but it doesn't really matter. We know that it's the word of God anyway.
Yes, and you're quite right. Hebrews has so many very basic ideas to us that you'd think we would understand, but somehow these ideas have sometimes gotten corrupted in the churches, and well, we know about the Sabbath, of course. Most of the churches don't keep the Sabbath. And so it has a lot of those basic ideas in it and is the root of a lot of basic understandings because he was talking to people who had kind of fallen away from Christianity and he needed to give them those basics to bring them back up. So this is a source of basics for us as well. Okay,
Hey Sam, I
yeah,
have a question.
sure.
So, I've always thought that in that area, entering into God's rest was more of a him telling us, you know, come into my rest, come into my peace.
No,
You know,
rest and peace are different things. Jesus does say, "My peace I give to you," but rest is different from that. And you'll see that when God took his rest after creation, it doesn't say that he took peace or anything like that. So the rest is really different. Now, you can rest and have peace. In fact, we use the expression rest in peace, but they are separate things.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, moving on. Wait, did I skip one? I can't go back. Okay, um, so he's made the point that that rest still exists for us because David talked about that. So now Hebrews 4:9 says, "So then it remains for the people of God to keep the Sabbath." And so in the translation that I like to use, this is crystal clear. This is what it says in my translation, but you won't find that in the other translations. I talked about that in the previous lesson, where they've taken that word sabbatismos and found a new meaning for it and took out the word keeping entirely. And so, so most other translations don't say it like this, and you have to kind of read between the lines to get back to what is really meant. And I won't go into how that all happened again because we covered that last lesson. But what his argument has been, God's rest is still available. David said that, he made that clear, and God speaking through David, of course. And so that rest is still available, therefore we still keep the Sabbath. And so that's the connection here, is that that rest is still there, so the Sabbath keeping is still there. And so Hebrews 4:10 pairs up with 4:9 very well. And it takes that idea and it says, "For whoever enters his rest has rested from his works as God has from his own." Now, so what the author is doing here is he's setting up a parallel. He says, we enter his rest because, and here's the parallel, we rest from our works as God rested from his works. Okay? So we do this just as God did this. It is the parallel that's being set up in the verses here. And that's actually quite an important thing because the mainline Christian churches twist this verse just as they twist verse 4:9 so that it doesn't sound like it's a parallel anymore. And what they do is they say, well, this is telling us that we should rest from our sinful works, okay? That it isn't talking about resting from, it isn't talking about Sabbath keeping is what they really want to get to. That it's a message that we should rest from our sinful works. The problem with that is that if it's a parallel, then the same words should apply to God. So the sentence should become, we rest from our sinful works as God rested from his sinful works. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. And so that parallel is actually quite a useful tool for shedding silly ideas like that, if only you will apply that. But nonetheless, that's what happens. There's a whole bunch of different ways that they use to twist that, and that's just one of them. But that happens. So 4:9 and 4:10, really, if you look at them, um, are the strongest support for Sabbath keeping that you can find. And that's why mainline Christians have had a need to twist them up to make them say something different than they actually say. Okay, now here again, we're going to see this same idea of watching ourselves. And this is Hebrews 4:11. It says, "Let us take pains, therefore, to enter that rest, lest we fall in the manner of those who are not persuaded." So unless we fall as dry, dead bones in the wilderness, is what he's saying, as the Hebrews did, or as the Israelites did in the desert. And so, again, this is a call to working at watching ourselves so that we will enter that rest. Because of the deceptions of sin, we can be dragged away step by step, slowly, that we don't even know it's happening. And so we need to keep watching ourselves, make sure that we aren't sliding backwards. Our relationship with God isn't decaying, that that we're still keeping up the prayer life and the Bible reading and all those things that are good for us. And so we need to keep monitoring ourselves to make sure we aren't falling away, because that's what Satan does. He wants to get you to slowly fall away. And so that's what this is really about, is that we need to make an effort to do that, so that we will enter that rest. And so he's been talking about faith all along here. That's how we started here. And now he's talking about Sabbath keeping. And he doesn't say it explicitly, but he's really making the point that Sabbath keeping is an act of faith. And it is. It's hard for us maybe to understand it that way in our society. But back when you were a farmer and growing a crop, or you had grapes on the vines, or whatever it was you were doing that way, taking a day off from your work could have been critical to things. If your farm or your crops needed to be harvested, or your animals needed to have something done with them, or whatever you were raising or doing, and you had to take a day off, that was a day of faith. You were trusting that God would take care of you, because you weren't able to harvest your crops or do the things that you wanted to do to make your living. And so the Sabbath is only one day, so it's only a small act of faith. The other Sabbaths, as they are called in the Bible, are longer periods of times, sometimes weeks. One of the Sabbaths is a whole year long, and that was the one that the Israelites never did keep. And so all of the Sabbaths were acts of faith, trusting that God would care for you, and taking that time off from caring for yourself. And so that's really what the point is here, is faith, trusting in God. And the Sabbath keeping is one of those acts of faith where we trust God to take care of all of the worldly things in our lives, while we take some time off from all of the things in our lives that we need to do to keep things going. And so keeping the Sabbath can help us keep faith, keep us from falling away as well. And so that weekly Sabbath is a blessing to us in that it keeps reminding us, keeps bringing us back. It's that opportunity to once again restore that relationship of trusting in God. And as I said, one day is not so long that you couldn't trust God. But still, each Sabbath, each weekly Sabbath is a day of rest where we trust God to take care of the worldly things for us. So, but we need to understand that the Sabbath can also be kept without faith, and that's where the verses are going to go next. You can keep the Sabbath for wrong reasons. You can keep it just because that's what you do. Today is the Sabbath, and so we do this, and then we do this, and we do this. And so if it just becomes a routine, and it's no more than that in your life, then you aren't keeping the Sabbath. You've drifted away from the Sabbath keeping. And so the Sabbath should be something that is real in your life, and not something you do just because it's a routine, not something you do because somebody told you had to do it. It should be something that you do because that's really what you want to do, and you want to rest, and you understand what the Sabbath is, and that you are resting because that's what God wanted you to do. So you can keep the Sabbath for the wrong reasons, and we see that so much in Jesus' time, where the people at that time were keeping the Sabbath as much of a ritual. And they had a whole bunch of rules associated with it, and had tied it down and made it a nuisance for people instead of being the joy that it's supposed to be. Many times in the Old Testament it says you should have joy in the Sabbath. It should be a day for joy and not for a day for sorrow. And that comes out in many other places. So that's what the Sabbath should be to us. It's an act of faith, and it should be something that we are joyful for, and not something that we do because we feel we have to do. And so that, as I said, is going to continue on into the next verses here. And these verses are ones that people often don't realize are continuing on with that same message about the Sabbath and faith. And so I'll read through them now. And it says, "For the word of God is living and all efficient and much sharper than a double-edged sword, and it pierces to the separation of soul and spirit and of joints, marrow, and of bones, and judges the reasoning and conscience of the heart. And there is no created thing hidden from before him, but everything is naked and open before the eyes of him to whom we give an account." So, as I said, most people don't realize this is a continuation on of the discussion before it about faith and the Sabbath. And what it's saying is that what in the previous verse it said, you need to keep monitoring yourself to make sure. And here it's saying you can't fake the Sabbath. If you're really keeping the Sabbath, then the Word of God, or if you aren't keeping it, then the Word of God will know that and dig into you and point that out to you and it looks at the conscience of your heart. It knows why you're doing it, why you're keeping it, and whether you're actually doing it for God or doing it for other reasons. And so it's talking about the Word of God being digging into you. It doesn't literally mean your bones and your joints. It's talking about spiritual matters. But it says the Word of God points out all those things inside of you. It says you're doing this for the wrong reason. You're doing this for the right reason. And so that's what the Word of God is, living and all efficient, and digs into you and pierces between soul and spirit, and understands what's inside of you. And God sees all of these things. And so the point is that you can't fake faith, as I said. The Word of God will show what your errors are, show them to you if you're listening, and God sees everything. So why you do things, and this can be applied more generally, of course. God sees everything, not just your faith, not just how you keep the Sabbath, but He sees everything that you do. Nothing is hid from Him at all. And He knows why you do things, and not just that you have done things, but He knows why you've done those things. And so the message here is faith is seen by God, and He knows if it's real faith, or if He knows that it's just something that you're doing. Okay, so that ends the Sabbath part of this, and next week we'll finish up. There's, I think, 3 verses left in chapter 4, which are getting onto the idea of Jesus as a high priest, and that's going to continue on in chapter 5, and he's going to start talking about Melchizedek, who is hardly ever mentioned in the Old Testament. There's just a few references, but it's a key that the author of Hebrews is going to use to explain some ideas about who Jesus was. And with that, we're also going to see how the Jews had to twist the psalmist's words. And now this would be the Jews just after Jesus' time, because Jesus' followers were claiming that he was a high priest. And so they found, and using this verse from David as support for that. And so we'll see how the Jews had to twist that verse to get it to mean something different, so that Jesus couldn't be a high priest. So we'll see all of those things next week when we dig into this study again.